The laughter was deafening, echoing off the apartment walls like it was feeding on me. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, glass in hand, smirking as he said, "Careful, she might panic if someone breathes too loud." My chest tightened instantly. The warmth of the wine in my hand turned to ice, my throat locking as every set of eyes landed on me. "Daniel," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. But it cracked anyway. He grinned wider, his friends snickering like hyenas circling prey. "Oh, come on, babe," he said. "It's just a joke." But it wasn't. It was my worst fear, ripped out and thrown on the table for everyone to feast on. My hands shook, the leash looped around my wrist, pulling slightly as Max, my golden retriever, looked up at me. The room felt smaller, air heavier, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood up without a word, the chair scraping sharply against the hardwood. The laughter didn't stop. His voice followed me as I reached for the door. "You're proving my point." My face burned as I stepped into the cold night air, gripping the leash, leaving the warmth of their cruel amusement behind. The cold air bit into my cheeks, my breath turning into quick clouds in the dim streetlight glow. Max trotted beside me, his fur catching the light like embers. I kept my head down, my heart still a frantic drum beat. Daniel's voice replayed in my mind, sharper than the wind. "Just a joke." But it wasn't. It was a crack in the wall I'd built to protect myself. My fingers ached from gripping the leash too tightly. The streets were quiet. The distant hum of a passing car, the only sound breaking the silence. I wanted to scream, but instead I swallowed it, the burn in my throat making it worse. The warmth of the apartment, the laughter, the wine, it all felt like another planet now. I walked faster, as if I could outpace the shame crawling over my skin. It wasn't the first time he'd joked about my anxiety, but it was the first time he did it with an audience. I remembered the day I told him about my first panic attack, how I'd sat on the floor of my apartment clutching my chest, certain I was dying. He'd listened then, held my hand, promised he'd never use it against me. Back then, his eyes had been warm, his voice steady. Tonight, those same eyes were lit with amusement, not care. My chest tightened again, not from panic this time, but from something heavier, betrayal. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I neared my building. I pulled it out, the cold making my fingers stiff. A message from Sarah. "Sorry about earlier. I didn't know what to say." Another from Josh. "You're too sensitive." My stomach twisted. The words blurred together under the streetlight. Some tried to defend me, others dismissed me. But they all kept the same truth. No one had stopped him. The ache settled deeper, heavier than the cold. By the time I reached my apartment, my jaw ached from clenching it. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and laundry detergent. Max padded ahead, nails clicking softly on the floor. I shut the door behind us, leaning against it, the silence pressing in. I set my keys down, unhooked his leash, and he immediately sat at my feet, looking up like he knew something was wrong. I knelt beside him, burying my face in his fur. The warmth there was real, the only thing that didn't feel tainted tonight. Morning light filtered softly through the bedroom curtains, casting gentle lines across the worn wooden floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a storm of thoughts. The heaviness in my chest hadn't lifted overnight. Max curled beside me, his warm body a quiet anchor. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, but I didn't reach for it. I thought about Daniel's words, replaying the night's cruel echo. How had something so small, a joke, cut so deep? I knew I couldn't go back to that apartment. That laughter. The idea of facing him, of pretending everything was normal, felt unbearable. I traced Max's fur with trembling fingers, hoping the comfort he gave would last just a little longer. By noon I forced myself up, the walls closing in as I dressed quietly. I paced the small kitchen, clutching a mug of cold coffee, my eyes tracing the chipped paint on the windowsill. Max watched me, his tail thumping softly on the tile floor. I thought about calling Sarah, about explaining everything, but the words felt stuck, tangled in my throat. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the city pulse with life beyond my reach. The noise of the street seemed overwhelming, but so did the silence of my apartment. I wanted to scream, to break free from the invisible cage Daniel's words had built around me. But I stayed still, caught between wanting to fight and wanting to disappear. The afternoon brought a knock at the door, unexpected and sharp. My heart skipped. Sarah stood there, her face soft but uncertain. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She entered quietly, carrying a bag of groceries, breaking the silence with small jokes and gentle questions. It was the first kindness I'd allowed in days. We sat together on the threadbare couch, her presence filling the empty spaces in the room. I told her bits of the story, carefully, like unwrapping a fragile gift. She didn't judge, only listened, her eyes steady. I felt a crack in the loneliness, a tiny seed of hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. That evening, I sat by the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Max rested his head on my lap as I scrolled through messages, some kind, some indifferent. Daniel's text sat unread, a quiet wound. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness rise inside me. The future felt uncertain, like a road shrouded in fog. But beneath the fear was a fragile determination. I needed to reclaim myself, to stand up against the quiet erosion of my spirit. Tonight, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find my voice, even if it trembled. For now, the night held me gently, a calm before whatever storm might come. Sleep was elusive. I lay awake, listening to Max's steady breathing beside me. Memories of the night before kept surfacing, tangled with hopes for tomorrow. I thought of strength, not the kind shown in loud protests, but quiet endurance, the kind that grows in the cracks of broken moments. The sun was still hours away, but inside me, a small light flickered. I would face what came next. For me, for Max, for the person I was still becoming. Whatever that journey looked like, I wasn't alone. The next morning felt heavy, like walking underwater. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate. The weight of the previous night's pain clung to me, but there was a flicker of resolve beneath it. I packed a small bag, essentials and Max's leash, preparing to leave the apartment for a while. The city outside bustled as usual, indifferent to my turmoil. I stepped out into the crisp air, the sun barely risen, casting long shadows on the pavement. Max trotted beside me, tail wagging cautiously. My heart was pounding, not from anxiety, but from the strange freedom of stepping away from the place where my spirit had been bruised. I wandered through the neighborhood, seeking a place that felt safe. The park's trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, leaves rustling like whispered encouragement. Max sniffed eagerly, pulling me toward a quiet bench. I sat down, letting the world pause around me. For the first time in days, I let tears fall freely. No shame or fear. The vulnerability felt like a crack in the armor I'd been building. A woman jogging past smiled softly, a small act of kindness in a day shadowed by doubt. I realized I wasn't invisible. Even in my brokenness, there was connection waiting to be found. By midday, the sun was higher, and I found myself in a small cafe, nursing a lukewarm coffee. The noise around me was a hum, muffled by my thoughts. I stared out the window, watching passers-by with their effortless smiles and busy lives. I thought about Daniel, his laughter that night still ringing harshly in my mind. But here, surrounded by strangers, I felt a fragile peace. Max rested his head on my lap, grounding me. I whispered promises to myself, small affirmations that maybe, just maybe, I deserve better than mockery and silence. The road ahead was uncertain, but I would take it step by step. The afternoon brought a phone call, Sarah's voice, warm and steady. She reminded me I wasn't alone, that reaching out was a strength, not a weakness. I felt tears rise again, but this time mixed with gratitude. We made tentative plans to meet later, a lifeline thrown across the storm. Hanging up, I realized how much I'd withdrawn, how much I needed these connections to rebuild. I looked down at Max, who wagged his tail as if he understood. The day had begun as a battle within, but now there was hope threading through the cracks. I was beginning to believe I could heal. As dusk settled, I stood by the window watching the city lights blink away. Max rested his head on my lap, steady and comforting. I breathed deeply, feeling a quiet strength growing inside me, a small flame after a long night. The path wasn't clear, and the future held unknowns, but I had begun to reclaim my story. Tonight, I would rest without the weight of shame. Tomorrow, I would face whatever came with open eyes. I was still me, bruised, yes, but unbroken. The morning light spilled softly through the curtains as I woke, the silence of the apartment almost unfamiliar. I reached out for Max, feeling his warmth beside me, a tether to reality. Daniel's words haunted my mind, but I was determined to hold on to the fragile calm I'd found. Today, I needed to set boundaries, to protect the space I was carving out for myself. Each small act of self-care was an act of rebellion. I dressed quietly, the cool breeze from the open window brushing my skin, promising new possibilities, even if I wasn't ready to fully believe it. I met Sarah at the cafe, the place already humming with life. Her smile was steady, a reminder that some friendships withstand storms. We talked quietly, my voice shaky but gaining strength with each word. She listened without judgment, offering comfort in silence and wisdom in her gentle advice. It felt like the first time in a long while that I was truly seen, beyond the anxiety and pain. I realized I'd been hiding behind fear for too long. Today was about reclaiming my voice, even if it trembled. Later, as I walked Max through the busy park, the world seemed simultaneously overwhelming and beautiful. The laughter of children, the chatter of strangers, and the rustle of leaves filled the air. I paused, closing my eyes to steady my breath. Anxiety whispered its usual threats, but I pushed back gently, reminding myself that this moment was mine. Max tugged on the leash, eager to explore, and I smiled despite the tension. Each small victory felt monumental, a quiet defiance against the shadows lurking inside me. Back at the apartment, I sat by the window, journal open on my lap. Writing had become a refuge, a place to unravel the tangled thoughts inside my mind. I scribbled fragments of pain and hope, the ink bleeding across the pages like a lifeline. The evening light softened the room, casting long shadows. I felt raw but honest, peeling back layers I hadn't dared to touch before. Maybe this was how healing began, not with grand gestures, but with small truths laid bare. Night fell quietly, wrapping the city in a blanket of stars and distant sounds. I curled up on the couch with Max, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm against the silence. Despite the heaviness still present, I felt a subtle shift within me, a quiet strength that refused to be silenced. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for now, I allowed myself this moment of peace. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to walk it, one shaky step at a time. The knock came like a jolt, sharp against the quiet evening. I opened the door to find Daniel standing there, unannounced, his posture taut, eyes darting with unease, but lined with frustration. His jaw was tight, but his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I stayed where I was, my body blocking the doorway, unwilling to let him step into the fragile peace I'd fought for. The warmth of my apartment pressed against the cooler night air between us. "You don't get to laugh at my anxiety," I said, the words steady but edged with a tremor I refused to hide. His mouth twisted into a scoff, the same one he'd used to brush off my feelings before. But then, for just a second, I caught it. A flicker in his gaze. A shadow of regret or maybe recognition. Still, it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. This confrontation had been inevitable, a line drawn in sand that had already hardened into stone. I wasn't going to let him cross it again, not when I'd finally found my voice. I didn't wait for him to say more. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me, the lock clicking into place like a final word. Max padded quietly at my side, his leash loose in my hand. The street was hushed, pools of amber light from the lamp spilling onto the slick pavement. The air smelled faintly of rain, and my breath came faster than my steps. My heart raced, not from fear alone, but from the strange cocktail of relief and uncertainty. I didn't know where my feet were carrying me, only that I couldn't stay still. Each step was an escape from the sting of humiliation, from the heaviness of a trust that had been cracked open too many times. Max walked close, his quiet presence like a pulse reminding me I was not truly alone. Even when I felt invisible, there was still this: the rhythm of paws on wet concrete, the night stretching ahead, and the knowledge that leaving was a choice I had finally made. The pier found me without my trying. Boards groaned under my steps as I walked to the edge, the sea sighing against the wooden posts. The wind bit at my cheeks, tugging at my coat, but the air was clean and sharp. Max settled beside me, his head resting on his paws as I sat down. The waves carried a steady rhythm, drowning the noise that had been screaming in my mind. I closed my eyes, letting the briny air sting my skin in a way that felt almost like a baptism, a stripping away of the residue he'd left on me. Memories surfaced, stubborn and tangled. Our laughter here once, his hand warm in mine, before the jabs and the careless words. Each image carried both sweetness and ache. But beneath them was something else, a clarity I hadn't expected. My flaws, my anxiety didn't erase my worth. Respect and kindness weren't luxuries, they were necessities, and I would no longer live without them. By morning, the cold air of the pier had faded from my skin, but its clarity lingered. I called Sarah again, needing to tether myself to someone who understood. Her voice was steady, carrying the kind of warmth that didn't demand anything in return. I told her about the fear that gnawed at me, fear of being left behind, of being too much. She didn't tell me I was overreacting. She didn't rush to fix it. She just listened, and when she spoke, her words wrapped around me like a blanket. "You're not alone in this, you matter." It was simple, but it was real. I realized then how starved I'd been for care that wasn't conditional, for connection that didn't come with a tally sheet. Her support felt fragile but true, a thread I could hold on to in the days ahead. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I could face whatever came next, and not break. That evening, I stood before the mirror, hands resting on the sink. The overhead light cast a warm glow, catching the edges of my reflection. I searched my own eyes, finding traces of the bruises that weren't visible, the whispered doubts, the erosion of self-worth. They were there, but they didn't own me. I studied the curve of my mouth, the set of my shoulders, the quiet strength that had been forged in moments like this. Max padded in and sat behind me, his reflection appearing in the glass. "I am enough," I whispered, the words catching before they grew stronger. They weren't for anyone else to hear, not Daniel, not even Sarah, only me. This wasn't about becoming flawless. It was about survival, and more than that, about living in a way that felt whole. Tonight I chose to keep going, for me, and for Max, who needed me unbroken. The phone buzzed late into the night, Daniel's name flashing on the dark screen. My heart clenched, a chaotic mix of dread and lingering care. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I answered. His voice was soft, almost broken, apologizing for mocking my anxiety in front of everyone. He admitted he was wrong, that he hadn't realized how deeply he hurt me. But years of pain and betrayal aren't so easily erased by words. I wasn't sure if I could forgive, yet part of me ached to hear his voice again, to find closure, or maybe just understand why he had acted that way. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant to make you feel small." The silence between us stretched, heavy and uncertain. The morning light filtered through the curtains as I sat by my desk, pouring thoughts onto crisp journal pages. Writing became a lifeline, a way to confront the whirlwind inside my mind. Each word peeled back layers of confusion, anger, and fear. I scribbled memories of Daniel's cruel words, the sting of his laughter, but also the flicker of hope buried beneath the hurt. This was my space to untangle the mess, reclaim control. The ache lingered, but so did resilience, a fragile thread weaving itself through the pages. I didn't know where this path would lead, but in this quiet ritual, I found strength to face another day. Later, I met Sarah at a small sun-dappled cafe tucked away from the noise of the city. Her presence was a balm, steady and kind. Over steaming cups of coffee, we talked about boundaries and self-care, how important it was to protect my peace. Sarah didn't sugarcoat it. She told me healing wasn't a straight line, and that was okay. Her words reminded me I didn't have to be perfect, just honest, with myself and those around me. For the first time in a long while, I felt understood, less alone in this tangled mess of emotions. We laughed softly, shared tears, and I realized I was ready to start rebuilding. As dusk settled, Max and I wandered through the quiet park, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath our feet grounding me in the moment. The amber glow of street lamps bathed the path in soft light. Max's happy eyes and wagging tail reminded me of simple joys amid chaos. I inhaled deeply, feeling a rare calmness wash over me. It wasn't about erasing pain instantly, but finding strength in small steps forward. Walking with Max, I realized I didn't have to carry this burden alone. This furry companion was my anchor, reminding me to keep moving, no matter how slow. Before bed, I sat on the windowsill, gazing at the city's glittering skyline, the hum of distant traffic a soothing background. Wrapped in a soft blanket, I whispered a promise to myself, not to let anxiety define me, to seek help when needed, and to believe in my own worth. Anxiety would still come in waves, but I was learning to face it with growing courage. Tomorrow was uncertain, yes, but I felt ready to meet it on my own terms. The night held a fragile peace, a quiet resolve stirring deep inside me, whispering that maybe, just maybe, I could finally begin to heal. She sits at her desk, pen hovering over paper, the quiet hum of the city bleeding in through the window. The lamplight warms the curve of her wrist as she exhales slowly, willing her thoughts into order. The page remains empty for several long breaths, her pulse steady but heavy. Then she begins, "I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to write it." Each letter feels like loosening, a knot tied deep inside. Her words spill not to wound, but to release herself. She tells him she loved him once with the kind of fire that kept her alive, and how slowly that fire turned cold under the weight of careless hands. She confesses she was afraid of being small, of being laughed at, of disappearing under someone else's voice. She tells him that fear has burned away, leaving only something stronger. Dog stirs at her feet, his quiet breathing steady as a metronome, grounding her here. She signs her name slowly, ink pressing deep, then folds the letter. It feels lighter than the weight it carried in her chest. For a long moment, she stares at the envelope, as if it might speak back. Then softly she whispers, "This is the last thing I'll ever give you." The dog lifts his head as she pushes her chair back, nails clicking softly against the floor. She kneels, burying her hands in the familiar warmth of his fur, pressing her forehead to his. "You're safe now," she murmurs, though the words feel like they belong to both of them. His tail thumps lazily, a steady rhythm against the wood. She smiles faintly through damp lashes. The room holds only their breathing, the quiet hum of the heater, and the faint ticking of the clock. She thinks of nights when panic gripped her lungs and he stayed beside her until morning. He never asked her to be smaller, never mocked the tremor in her voice, never told her she was too much. His love is unspoken but constant. She clings to it for a moment longer. Finally, she stands, envelope in hand, and gestures toward the door. "Come on." The dog rises immediately, loyal eyes fixed on her, ready to follow her anywhere she chooses to go. She stops at the door, fingers curling around the cool brass knob. The hallway beyond is shadowed, waiting. She pulls her phone from her pocket, thumb swiping until his name appears. "Hello." Her chest tightens at the sight of it, not from longing, but from the weight of every memory stitched to those letters. She remembers the easy charm, the slow erosion, the way she learned to flinch at laughter. Her thumb hovers. She breathes deep, as if preparing for a plunge. Then she presses and holds until the delete option glows red against the glass. Her pulse is steady now. She taps. His name vanishes, leaving behind a clean space where something heavy used to be. The silence that follows is startling, like a room emptied of echoes. The dog tilts his head, sensing the change. She smiles at him, a small private smile. "That's one thing done," she says, and opens the door to the waiting night. The night air greets her with a sharp chill, carrying the faint smell of rain. The dog trots beside her, his paws whispering against the wet pavement. Street lamps carve golden circles into the dark. The envelope rests in her pocket, paper edges worn from her grip. She walks with purpose, though each step feels heavier the closer she comes to his door. She imagines him inside, maybe laughing at something on TV, unaware she's outside ending the story they began together. Her breath fogs as she climbs the steps, leaving the dog patiently below. Her fingers slip the envelope under the door. The sound is soft, almost nothing, yet it feels louder than it should. For a moment, she stands still, listening to the muffled hum from inside. She turns without knocking, her steps light but certain as she descends back to the street. The city is hushed as she walks away, the rhythm of her boots and the dog's paws the only sounds. The leash swings in her hand, catching the glow of passing lamps. She turns a corner where they once lingered, laughter spilling like light, a memory now softened by distance. It no longer feels like a wound, only a chapter that has closed. The dog glances up, brown eyes reflecting lamplight, waiting for her signal. She meets his gaze, the night air cold in her lungs. "I won't wait for you anymore," she says softly. The words are not for the dog, but for the ghost of him that still tried to live in her chest. They float into the night and vanish like steam. Ahead, the city stretches out in wet streets and glowing windows, and for the first time in a long while, she feels the pull to keep walking forward.